and we'll finish up Unit 4 with topics 4.6, 4.8, and 4.9. Okay, the first topic is watersheds, and you don't have to know that much for 4.6. So you need to know the definition of a watershed, which is the area of land that drains into a particular body of water, and that you can have disturbances like clear cutting a forest or a housing development that can impact a watershed far away, because some of these places that drain into a river are miles and miles and miles away. Okay, so you need to know that watersheds are characterized by their area, length, slope, soils, and vegetations. The area and length can be very impactful. The larger the area or the longer it is, it affects more areas. The impacts to the watershed affect more. If there's a small watershed and there's a big change, it can have a larger effect because there's just a small area that is impacted. So that particular watershed has more impact because it's not spread out. All right, so slope is the steepness of the land. If the land is more sloped, it will drain faster into the watershed. If it's flatter, water will remain in one area longer. Now, soil types can be important in a watershed. You learned about different types of soil. So how much water can permeate, which means soak underground, depends on whether it has a lot of sand, silt, and clay. Remember, sand makes things, the permeability increase with more sand. Vegetation, what type of plants are there? If you've got a lot of trees with a lot of roots, your soil is going to remain in place better than if there's not a lot of roots of the soil. And humans can impact watersheds through adding too many nutrients like fertilizer or manure runoff. We can dam rivers, which can decrease the water flow in watersheds. We can mine for minerals in a watershed, which can impact a river with toxic chemicals. We'll learn more about mining Unit 5. And impermeable surfaces, so things like asphalt and concrete, will not allow water to soak in underground and can impact. More water runs off into a river, which can flood a river. So those are all kinds of impacts for a watershed. All right, so now we're going to go on to the next topic about Earth's geography. So in the last video lecture, we talked about air currents that can make the heat of the Earth distribute from the equator to the poles more readily. Oceanic currents do that really, really well as well. So what causes all these currents to move around the globe? Well, there's unequal heating, there's gravity, there's wind, there's salinity, there's where the continent is in comparison to the water. All of these things are factors. So let's talk about some of them. So you can see in these dots a little bit uneven heating of water. You can see that there is some cold water in blue, warm water in oranges. And so it's pretty uneven heating because, well, the sun is stronger at the equator. And there's also different heights of water in the ocean, which seems strange, but different heights of water and different temperatures. There's also places where the water is saltier than others. All these can impact density. Then we have the Coriolis effect, and we have winds that can blow and make waves that can mix up the water in that way. And you also need to know what a gyre is. It's a counterclockwise movement of water, and clockwise. So clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And let's take a look at those. All right, so we have a few main gyres. The one that affects us in Southern California is the North Pacific Gyre, and it goes around like this with my cursor. So where we live in Southern California, the reason why the water is so cold at the beach in California, for example, where I live, we mostly go to the beach just north of Los Angeles, and it's normally in the summer about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is considered warm in August to have that type of temperature. But the water is coming from Alaska, so it comes down from Alaska. Now, once it goes south from us, it's going to travel along the equator. It's going to pick up heat because it's on the equator. And by the time it gets over here in Asia, it's going to be nice warm water. Then it's going to travel up the coast of Asia here, and then it's going to cool down in the poles and then come back around. And then these gyres go this way. Later on, let's look at the Atlantic. So you've got the gyres here in the Atlantic. So one of the reasons why the eastern United States, the beaches in the Jersey Shore or Florida or the Carolinas is warm water is because the water's coming up from the equator. So it's nice warm water that brings that nice warm water to the ocean and then shoots it over here to Europe. And we have here part of this current is called the Gulf Stream, and it brings warm water over here to Northern Europe. And this is one of the reasons why people can live and grow crops here in Northern Europe, which is the same latitude here in Canada where it's really too cold to do that stuff over here. But same latitude over here, you've got Scotland, Norway, Sweden. You can live, you can grow crops, and that has to do with this current that brings warmer weather here than it does in other parts of the world at the same latitude. Okay, so what do you have to know in terms of currents? Well, you have to know kind of how the currents work. You need to be able to read a map of cold and warm currents. You need to know what a gyre is. So we have here this North Atlantic gyre, South Atlantic gyre, North Pacific gyre. Later on, we're also going to study the Great Pacific Garbage Patches. So there's these big patches of trash floating in the ocean kind of in the middle of each of these four gyres. And it's the reason why they're kind of in the middle is because the gyres sort of corral the trash into these center locations. So we'll study that later on, but then you also just need to understand how the ocean moves and be able to read a map when you see a map. Okay, another way that the ocean moves is through upwelling. So what happens is that because of the currents and the Coriolis effect, so if the current, for example, is moving south along the coast of California, so the gyre, the California current's part of that gyre, it's coming from Alaska down the coast of California, it's moving south. Well, the Coriolis effect is going to divert that water, the surface water, away. So the spin of the earth is going to make that water, instead of moving south, it's going to move to, well, in the case of California, it's going to move to the west. Just the surface water. And then from below, there's room for cold water from below to come to the top. So why is that good? Well, because nutrients are at the bottom and sunlight's at the top. So your photosynthesizers want to live here near the surface because of sun. But photosynthesizers and our producers, our algae, our phytoplankton, they need nutrients to survive. Nutrients come from decaying dead stuff, a dead whale, a dead shark. It sinks to the bottom and is decomposed, and so all of those NPK nutrients are down here. And then runoff from land. So runoff from land can bring NPK, but it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So our nutrients are at the bottom, our light's at the top, and that's a problem for producers. So anywhere you have upwelling, where this process will bring nutrients from the bottom to the surface, now you've got producers that are super happy. They've got light, they've got nutrients, and they create a bloom, a phytoplankton bloom, which then can feed your zooplanktons, then can feed your fish and your marine mammals and your sharks. And so you have massive biodiversity in places where there's upwelling. Okay, also, the second bullet point is about thermohaline circulation. This is deep ocean currents, and that's on the next slide, so let's take a look. So here we have a pattern of thermohaline currents. You don't have to memorize this path, but you do need to be able to read a diagram. And so you need to understand that we have shallow warm currents here, and then they drop and they go super deep. So these super deep currents, they circulate all over the globe mixing the water. And it takes several years for the water to completely mix, but that is thermohaline circulation. Okay, so we're concerned that with climate change, our thermohaline circulation is going to get really changed a lot. This is a picture here, kind of from a different view. So the last picture, let me show you here, was a sideways view, kind of focusing on Europe and Africa and Asia. This one is the top, like, and one of the, that looks like the South Pole. And so you can see they've mapped it out with that view of the Earth as well. But again, you just need to be able to read a diagram, and they will tell you the color coding, whether they're deep or shallow or surface and cold or warm currents on the map. All right, so climate change. We're concerned that our glaciers are going to melt, which is going to add huge amounts of cold, fresh water, not salty water, into the ocean at a rapid pace, which will then change the densities of the water, which will change the currents, because the currents kind of feed off of density differences based on salinity and based on temperature. And so we're trying to predict through models what could happen with our ocean circulation in that way. Okay, so let's talk about something called the rain shadow effect. So the rain shadow effect is the reason why there's a lot of dry areas and deserts or chaparral shrublands behind mountain ranges from the ocean. So that's where I live. I live behind actually 2 mountain ranges from the Pacific Ocean. It's only an hour drive to get to the beach, where it's nice and cool compared to where I live. But because there are 2 mountain ranges that separate me from the ocean, I have drier conditions. Okay, so mountain ranges. If you're on the windward side, which is facing the wind, ocean wind is going to blow the air that has moisture in it up the side of a mountain. Then adiabatic cooling occurs and moisture is lost through precipitation. And then once wind moves down the leeward side, the winds become warm and dry. So you're going to have greener, lusher areas on the side facing the ocean, and the other side of the mountain, you're going to have the rain shadow effect. So let's take a look at that diagram. So we have wind blowing off of the ocean, and as that wind and air, which is full of moisture, it's warm, full of moisture, as it goes up and over the mountains, remember, as it rises, it's going to cool down. It's going to condense into clouds, and it's going to rain because colder air cannot hold as much moisture. So as the air temperature decreases as you rise in the altitude to get over that mountain, it's going to rain and drop that moisture. And then by the time you get over the mountain, you don't have as much moisture. So we do get rain where I live. So sometimes So the air goes up and over the mountains, and then you have drier, arid means dry, conditions on the other side. And so a lot of deserts are also found in the rain shadow effect. All right, let's go on to El Nino and La Nina. All right, so El Nino is something that happens where I live about every 4 or 5 years. I mean, technically it's 3 to 7 years. And it stands for El Nino. ENSO is really the official word, El Nino Southern Oscillation. It was named because this phenomena occurs around the Christmas holiday. And so the fishermen in Peru decades ago recognized this pattern, and they named El Nino after the Christ child because it occurred around Christmas time. So what happens is that you have this presence of warm water off the coasts of Peru, down here in South America. For me in California, it's up here. So we're going to say it's the eastern Pacific Ocean is where it is. We have the presence of warm water in the eastern Pacific Ocean, which is the western coasts of North and South America. So be real careful that you've got your easts and your wests not mixed up. Okay, so in normal years, we have our trade winds blowing toward the west, so the western Pacific. So here's our eastern Pacific, here's our western Pacific. The wind blows the water along the equator, and so our surface water blows this way. And from below, you have upwelling, cold, deep water, you have upwelling, which makes good fishing because you start your food web. During an El Nino year, either the trade winds can die off or they can blow the other direction. It just kind of depends what it feels like that time, that year. And there's actually a higher elevation, we call it a bulge of water, over here off the coast of equatorial Asia, that then starts to, by gravity, move back this way, bringing with it warm water. And you stop your upwelling. And in some cases you have downwelling, but you can just either just stop your upwelling or go to downwelling. Okay, so normal conditions, let's take a look at that. So we've got our water moving up here, down the coast of North America, up the coast of South America, moving along the equator. It picks up a lot of heat from solar radiation, and then it rains a lot over here. So this is why equatorial Asia gets a lot of rain. They have monsoon seasons. Okay, then down here we have El Nino. So that blowing of the winds, the trade wind stops and the water moves back this way. And now you've got warm water off the coasts. You've stopped your upwelling. And that's how El Nino works. Okay, so there's a few things that happens. The trade winds, they weaken, sometimes they reverse. The shift suppresses upwelling off the coast of Peru, California, where I live as well. Productivity and fish populations are reduced, South American coasts, so it's really bad for fishermen who rely on those fish to survive. Now it's a global phenomenon. It's not just it happens in the Pacific, but affects the whole globe. So southeastern U.S. gets cooler and wetter conditions than normal. The northern U.S., the Canada, southern Africa, and Southeast Asia becomes unusually dry. So if you usually have rain, it usually becomes drier. And it's really bad. Like Australia maps El Nino a lot because it actually creates huge dry and fire conditions for Australia. And so they really want to know when one's coming because there can be a lot of problems. In California, we want to know it's coming because of flooding. So we get a lot of waters. We get out of drought when we get an El Nino, but it also can cause massive flooding. All right, so I call La Nina a extreme normal. So sometimes it's the next year after an El Nino, sometimes it's not, but we have La Nina, and basically it's normal conditions but more. So cold water off our coast extends further in the equator. The trade winds blow in the normal direction, but they blow faster. We're normally a dry climate, we become drier. And so that's really La Nina. It's an extreme of what is the normal situation. And then we have our rainfalls. So one of the reasons why El Nino can be good where I live is because it brings the moisture and it often pops us out of drought conditions where I live. But it can cause problems for other places. If you go down here to Australia, it's very dry, drought, fires. So it's not great here. And in other places, it can cause flooding conditions in the wet areas. So these are, again, you don't have to memorize every location that's wet and dry. You do need to know in California, it brings wet conditions. In Peru, it brings wet conditions, which is the opposite of normal. And in some places like Australia, it brings drought and fire. All right, that's it for Unit 4.